Welcome to GoReadling Bedtime Stories, presented by GoReadling.com. Personalized education and reading skills for kids. Find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let our story carry you gently off to sleep. Tonight's story is called Puss in Boots. Once upon a time, in a sun-drenched countryside where the fields were golden with wheat and the hills were dotted with olive trees, there lived an old miller named Renard. He was a good man, kind and hard-working, but life had not been especially generous to him, and when he died one autumn evening, with the setting sun streaming through his window, he left behind very little for his 3 sons. To the eldest, Jacques, he left the mill itself, a sturdy stone building by the river with a great wooden wheel that turned day and night, grinding grain into flour. To the middle son, Pierre, he left the donkey, a strong, patient creature that could carry heavy sacks of flour to market and back without complaint. And to the youngest son, whose name was Luc, he left the cat. Luc sat on the doorstep of the mill and looked at the cat, and the cat sat on the cobblestones and looked at Luc, and neither of them seemed particularly pleased with the arrangement. The cat was a large ginger Tom with green eyes, a white patch on his chest, and an air of supreme self-confidence that seemed, under the circumstances, somewhat unwarranted. Luc was a good-natured young man of 18, slim and brown-haired, with a quick smile and a tendency to see the funny side of things. But even his natural optimism was being severely tested by his current situation. His brothers had a mill and a donkey. He had a cat. "Well," said Luc to no one in particular, "I suppose we could eat you, but that seems rather ungrateful, and you probably would not taste very good." And then the cat spoke. "I would prefer," said the cat, in a voice that was smooth and precise and faintly offended, "not to be eaten. And I would further suggest, young master, that you do not judge your inheritance too hastily. Your father was a wiser man than you realize, and I am a considerably more valuable asset than I appear." Luc stared at the cat. The cat stared back with an expression of complete composure, as if talking cats were the most ordinary thing in the world, and Luc was being rather slow to catch up. "You can talk," said Luc, very slowly. "I can do considerably more than talk," said the cat. "But first I am going to need a pair of boots, good leather ones, and a sack, the drawstring kind, large enough to hold a rabbit." Now, a sensible person might have questioned the cat. A practical person might have dismissed the whole thing as heat stroke or grief or some sort of elaborate hallucination brought on by the stress of suddenly becoming the poorest young man in the village. But Luc was not entirely sensible and not entirely practical. He was a youngest son, and youngest sons, as everyone knows, have a particular talent for believing in unlikely things. He had a few coins in his pocket, just enough for a pair of boots from the cobbler and a drawstring sack from the market, and he spent them all on exactly that, because what else was he going to do? His future appeared to consist of either trusting a talking cat or starving quietly in a ditch, and the cat option was, if nothing else, more interesting. The boots fit the cat perfectly, which was itself remarkable, since they had been sized for a small child, and no one had mentioned that they were for a cat. The cat pulled them on with evident satisfaction, flexing his paws inside the soft leather, and then he stood up on his hind legs in a way that should have looked absurd, but actually looked rather magnificent, like a small, furry general surveying his troops before a battle. He slung the sack over his shoulder, tipped an imaginary hat to Luc, and marched off toward the woods with a purposeful stride that suggested a cat with a very specific plan and no intention whatsoever of sharing it until the results were in. The cat's first stop was a meadow at the edge of the forest where he knew wild rabbits liked to graze. He opened the sack, placed inside it some fresh lettuce and a carrot he had pilfered from a garden along the way, and then lay down beside it, very still, with the drawstring held loosely in one paw. He waited. A cat, as you may know, can wait with a patience and stillness that would make a stone look fidgety. Within an hour, a plump young rabbit came hopping along, nose twitching, attracted by the smell of lettuce. It hopped right into the sack, and the cat pulled the drawstring shut in one smooth, lightning-fast motion. He then walked on his hind legs, his boots clicking smartly on the road, all the way to the royal palace. At the palace gate, the guards looked down at the cat in boots with expressions that moved rapidly from confusion to amusement to a kind of bewildered respect, because the cat carried himself with such complete authority that it seemed wrong to laugh, even though the situation was objectively hilarious. "I wish to see the king," said the cat. "I bear a gift from my master, the Marquis of Carabas." The guards looked at each other. They had never heard of the Marquis of Carabas, which was not surprising because the Marquis of Carabas did not exist. The cat had invented him approximately 45 minutes ago while walking through a turnip field. But the cat said it with such conviction, such unshakable certainty, that the guards found themselves stepping aside and opening the gate. King Augustin was a large, jovial man who loved hunting and feasting and a good story, and a talking cat in boots presenting a rabbit from a mysterious marquis was exactly the sort of thing that delighted him. He accepted the rabbit with a booming laugh, complimented the cat on his excellent boots, and sent his thanks to the Marquis of Carabas, whoever he might be. The cat bowed deeply and departed, and over the next several weeks he repeated this performance again and again. He caught partridges and pheasants and quail, he snared a brace of fine plump hares, and each time he brought his catch to the palace and presented it with a flourish as a gift from his master, the Marquis of Carabas. The king was charmed. He began to look forward to the cat's visits. Meanwhile, Luke was living in a tiny rented room above the bakery, working odd jobs, sweeping floors and carrying water, and helping the blacksmith at his forge. He had no idea what the cat was doing. The cat came and went at odd hours, always in his boots, always with that air of mysterious purpose. And whenever Luke asked what was going on, the cat would simply say, "Trust me, master, everything is proceeding according to plan." This was both reassuring and deeply alarming, because Luke had met people who said everything was going according to plan, and in his experience, it usually meant the plan was either non-existent or about to crash into a wall at considerable speed. But the cat had an air of such calm competence that Luke found himself trusting him despite every rational objection. One evening, the cat returned later than usual, his boots dusty from a long day on the road, and he found Luke sitting at the tiny table in his rented room, eating a supper of bread and cheese by candlelight. The cat jumped up onto the windowsill and groomed his whiskers with the air of a diplomat who has just concluded a particularly successful negotiation. "I have been to the palace again today," he said casually. "The king sends his compliments and says the quail I brought him yesterday was the finest he has ever tasted. He has begun referring to your master as one of the most generous nobles in the kingdom." Luke put down his bread. "I am not a noble," he said. "I am eating stale bread in a room that smells of flour and mouse droppings." The cat regarded him with an expression of serene unconcern. "Detail," he said. "You are thinking too small, master. You see the bread and the room. I see the trajectory. Trust the trajectory." And he curled up on the windowsill and went to sleep, leaving Luke staring at the ceiling and wondering what exactly a trajectory was and whether his was actually going somewhere or simply describing a very elaborate circle. The cat's opportunity came on a bright summer morning when he learned, through channels he declined to specify, that King Augustin was planning to take a carriage ride along the river road that afternoon, accompanied by his daughter, Princess Isabel. Now, Princess Isabel was everything a princess should be, and several things she should not. She was clever, headstrong, curious about the world, bored by court life, and possessed of a sharp wit that had reduced more than one pompous suitor to a stammering wreck. She was 20 years old, with dark eyes, an olive complexion, and a smile that could light up a ballroom or cut through pretension like a knife through butter, depending on her mood. She was also, the cat noted with satisfaction, unmarried. The cat had studied Princess Isabel carefully, the way a chess player studies the board before making a decisive move. He had observed her riding her horse through the palace grounds, fast and fearless, her dark hair streaming behind her. He had watched her dismiss a visiting duke with 3 words so perfectly chosen that the man had stood blinking for a full minute before realizing he had been insulted. He had seen her sneaking into the kitchen at midnight to make herself a sandwich, which she ate sitting on the back steps of the palace, looking up at the stars, her shoes off and her feet bare, and a look of such complete contentment on her face that the cat knew immediately that this was not a princess who cared about appearances. This was a princess who cared about truth. And truth, the cat reflected, was exactly what his master had to offer, once you stripped away all the pretense that the cat himself was so busily constructing around him. It was a paradox, but the cat was comfortable with paradoxes. He was, after all, a cat who wore boots. The cat raced back to Luke and told him in rapid, specific, non-negotiable terms exactly what was going to happen. "You are going to go to the river," the cat said, "to the spot where the road curves close to the bank, and you are going to take off your clothes and get in the water. When the king's carriage approaches, I will take care of the rest. You need only do 2 things. Keep your head above water, and do not, under any circumstances, contradict anything I say." Luke opened his mouth to object. The cat fixed him with a look of such concentrated feline authority that the objection died unspoken. 20 minutes later, Luke was standing waist-deep in the river, wondering how his life had come to this. The cat hid Luke's clothes under a heavy rock and waited by the roadside. When the royal carriage appeared, drawn by 4 white horses with gold harnesses and red plumes, the cat dashed into the road and began waving his paws and shouting with an urgency that would have won prizes at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. "Help! Help! My master, the Marquis of Carabas, is drowning. Thieves have stolen his clothes while he was bathing and left him to perish in the river. Help, I beg you." The king, recognizing the cat who had brought him so many fine gifts, immediately ordered the carriage to stop and sent his footman to pull Luke from the water. Princess Isabel watched from the carriage window as a young man was hauled from the river, dripping and shivering and looking thoroughly embarrassed. She noted that he was lean and tanned from honest work, with an open, expressive face and dark hair plastered to his forehead, and that, despite his obvious discomfort, there was a glint of humor in his eyes, as if he found his own predicament secretly funny. This interested her. Most of the men she met took themselves so seriously you could have used them as paperweights. The king ordered that a suit of fine clothes be brought from the carriage's luggage, and Luke was dressed in velvet and silk, and looked, to his own considerable surprise, rather handsome, like someone who belonged in fine clothes, rather than someone who had been stuffed into them against his will. The king invited the Marquis of Carabas to ride in his carriage, and Luke, remembering the cat's instruction to contradict nothing, climbed in. He found himself sitting across from Princess Isabel, who was studying him with an expression of frank, unapologetic curiosity. "So you are the Marquis of Carabas," she said. "I have heard a great deal about you from your remarkable cat." "He is a remarkable cat," Luke agreed, which was the most honest thing he had said all day. Isabel smiled. There was something about this supposed Marquis that she could not quite put her finger on, something that did not quite match the title and the fine clothes, a warmth, a naturalness, a complete absence of the stiff, self-important manner that she had come to expect from nobility. While the carriage rolled along the river road, the cat was sprinting ahead on his booted feet with a speed and determination that would have astonished anyone who happened to see a cat in boots running flat out through a wheat field. He came to a group of farm workers harvesting hay and skidded to a stop in front of them. "Listen carefully," he said, in a voice that allowed for absolutely no discussion. "The king's carriage is approaching. When he asks who owns these fields, you will say they belong to the Marquis of Carabas. If you do not say this, things will go very badly for you." The farm workers, confronted by a talking cat in leather boots, issuing threats with the casual confidence of a tax collector, decided unanimously that compliance was the wisest option. The cat repeated this performance at every field, vineyard, and orchard along the road. He was a blur of ginger fur and polished leather, racing from one group of workers to the next, always staying ahead of the carriage, always delivering the same message with the same terrifying certainty. And it worked. Every time King Augustin leaned out of the carriage and asked who owned the magnificent fields they were passing, the workers bowed and said, "These belong to the Marquis of Carabas, Your Majesty." The king was deeply impressed. The Marquis of Carabas appeared to own half the countryside. He looked at Luke with new respect, and even Isabel raised an eyebrow, though her expression suggested she was more amused than convinced. Inside the carriage, the conversation between Luke and Isabel had taken on a life of its own. She asked him about his life, and Luke, who was not skilled at deception and whose natural instinct was toward honesty, found himself telling her half-truths that were more revealing than lies. He told her about growing up in the mill, which he described as his family estate, and the way the water wheel sounded at night, a steady, rhythmic creaking that was the first thing he heard every morning and the last thing he heard at night. He told her about his father, who could tell the quality of grain by rubbing it between his fingers, and his mother, who had died when he was young and who had taught him to see beauty in ordinary things, in the way flour dusted every surface of the mill like a fine white snow, in the way the river changed color with the seasons, in the particular golden light of late afternoon when the whole world seemed to slow down and hold its breath. Isabel listened with that quality of attention that is itself a kind of gift, the full, undivided focus of a person who cares not just about what you are saying, but about who you are. But the cat's grandest move was still to come. At the end of the river road, perched on top of a hill surrounded by gardens and orchards, stood a magnificent castle. It was enormous, all towers and turrets and gleaming windows, and it belonged to an ogre. This ogre was the true owner of all the land the carriage had just passed through, a creature of immense size and immense power and immense appetite, who could, it was said, transform himself into any animal he wished. The local people lived in terror of him, which is why they had been so quick to say whatever the cat told them to say. Living near an ogre makes you very good at agreeing with whoever seems most dangerous at any given moment. The cat marched up to the castle door, knocked 3 times, and was admitted by a terrified servant. The ogre was in his great hall, sitting at a table that could have seated 50, eating what appeared to be an entire roasted ox. He was enormous, easily 10 feet tall, with a head like a boulder and hands like shovels, and small, shrewd eyes that regarded the cat with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "A cat in boots," said the ogre, around a mouthful of ox. "Now I have seen everything. What do you want, little creature?" The cat bowed with elaborate courtesy. "I have come," he said, "because I have heard of your legendary powers of transformation, and frankly, I do not believe a word of it. People exaggerate. It is what people do." The ogre's eyes narrowed. He was vain about his powers, as powerful beings often are, and the suggestion that they were mere gossip stung his pride like a wasp. "You doubt me?" he growled, and the rumble of his voice made the candelabers tremble. "Very well, little cat. Watch this." And before the cat's eyes, the ogre transformed himself into a mighty lion, enormous and golden, with a mane like a thundercloud and teeth like daggers. And he roared so loudly that the windows shook, and the candles blew out, and the cat's fur stood on end from nose to tail. But the cat did not run. He stood his ground, because he had known this was coming and had planned for it. And when the ogre returned to his natural form, breathing hard and looking smug, the cat simply nodded. "Impressive," said the cat, with the air of a theater critic who has seen better. "Truly impressive. Becoming something large and powerful, yes, that is all very well, but any magical creature can make himself bigger.
The real test, the truly extraordinary feat, would be to make yourself smaller. A mouse, for instance. I do not suppose you could transform yourself into something as small and insignificant as a mouse. The ogre laughed, a booming, contemptuous laugh that shook the portraits on the walls. A mouse? You insult me. Of course I can become a mouse. I can become anything. And in an instant, the enormous ogre shrank and shrank and shrank, until there, on the cold stone floor, where the 10-foot ogre had been standing, sat a tiny gray mouse, whiskers twitching, looking up at the cat with eyes that had just barely begun to register the magnitude of its mistake.
The cat pounced. It was over in a second. One moment there was a mouse, and the next there was only the cat, sitting on the flagstones of the great hall, licking his whiskers with the satisfied expression of a creature who has just completed a particularly elegant piece of work. He straightened his boots, smoothed his fur, and walked to the castle door, arriving just as the king's carriage pulled up outside. He flung the great doors open wide and bowed so deeply that his whiskers brushed the floor. "Welcome, your majesty," he said, with a sweep of his paw, "to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." King Augustin was overwhelmed. The castle was magnificent, the grounds were spectacular, and the Marquis of Carabas, who had seemed merely interesting before, now appeared to be one of the wealthiest and most important nobles in the entire kingdom. He beamed at Luke and clapped him on the shoulder and talked about hunting and harvests and what a fine young man he was. Isabel, meanwhile, was watching Luke with those sharp, dark eyes, and there was an expression on her face that was part admiration and part suspicion and part something else entirely, something warm and curious and not entirely under her control. She had noticed that the Marquis of Carabas held his fork the way a workman holds a tool, not the way a nobleman holds a utensil. That evening, a feast was held in the great hall. The ogre's kitchens were well stocked, and the cat had organized the terrified servants into a surprisingly efficient team. There was roasted duck and baked fish and fresh bread and salads and pastries and wine from the castle's own cellars. And King Augustin ate so much that he had to loosen his belt twice and fell asleep in his chair before dessert. While he snored gently, Isabel turned to Luke. "You are not really a marquis, are you?" she said quietly. Luke looked at her, and he could have lied. The cat would have wanted him to lie. The whole elaborate construction depended on the lie. But Isabel's eyes were honest and direct, and Luke found that he could not be anything other than honest and direct in return. "No," he said, "I am not. I am the son of a miller. My father left me nothing but a cat, and the cat, it turns out, is extremely ambitious and considerably smarter than I am. Everything you see here was arranged by him. The title, the lands, the castle. I am just a young man with no fortune and no prospects who happens to own the most extraordinary cat in the world." He waited for shock, for anger, for the cold withdrawal of someone who has been deceived. But Isabel just looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, quietly, a laugh that was warm and real and not at all offended. "I knew it," she said. "You hold your fork like a carpenter. But you also told me the truth when a lie would have been easier, and that, I think, is worth more than 1,000 castles." They were married in the autumn, in the castle on the hill, with the flags flying and the gardens in bloom, and the cat sitting in a place of honor on a velvet cushion, his boots freshly polished, looking as smug and satisfied as it is possible for a cat to look, which is very smug and very satisfied indeed. King Augustin gave his blessing cheerfully because he had grown genuinely fond of Luke, and because Isabel's happiness was the only thing that mattered to him more than hunting and feasting. The truth about Luke's origins came out eventually, as the truth always does, but by then it hardly mattered, because Luke had proven himself to be exactly the kind of person a kingdom needs: honest, hardworking, compassionate, and wise enough to listen to good advice, even when that advice comes from a cat. Luke became a good and just lord of the castle and all the lands around it. He invited his brothers to share in his fortune because he was not the kind of person who forgets where he came from, and Jacques brought his milling knowledge, and Pierre brought his donkey, and together they built a thriving estate where the workers were treated fairly, and the harvests were plentiful, and the granaries were always full. The cat, for his part, retired from scheming and spent his days lounging in patches of sunshine, chasing butterflies in the garden, and occasionally frightening visiting dignitaries by engaging them in conversation when they least expected it. He kept his boots, though. He wore them every day until they were old and soft and creased with wear. And when they finally wore out, Luke had a new pair made, the finest leather, the best craftsmanship, boots fit for the most remarkable cat who had ever lived. And that, dear little one, is the story of Puss in Boots, the clever cat who turned a poor miller's son into a lord, with nothing but a pair of boots, a sack, and an extraordinary amount of nerve. Remember, as you close your eyes tonight, that it does not matter what you start with. It does not matter if your inheritance is small, or your pockets are empty, or your future looks uncertain. What matters is cleverness and courage, and the willingness to take a chance on something that seems impossible. What matters is having friends who believe in you, even when you cannot quite believe in yourself. And what matters most of all is being honest at the moment when honesty costs you the most, because that is when it is worth the most too. Good night, little one. Sleep tight. And if you hear a cat walking in boots outside your window tonight, do not be alarmed. He is just on his way to do something extraordinary. And that is the end of our story. Thank you for listening to GoReadling Bedtime Stories. Visit GoReadling.com for more stories, reading adventures, and fun learning for kids. Sweet dreams, little one. Good night.